Good morning. If you would, open your Bibles to the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 6. That's where we're going to be beginning this morning. Sure is good to see everyone here this morning. You have several visitors. You're our honored guest. I'm glad to see you. Good to see your brother Sean back with us after his world travels. So glad to have him back with us. You know, with today being Mother's Day, I think that we can all agree that one of the greatest influences that God has placed in the world is the influence of a godly mother or mother figure, however you want to talk about it. And a lot of people, when they think about influence, they often think about famous people, the influence of a political leader, the influence of an athlete. But when we look in the scriptures, I want to challenge us to think that some of the greatest influences in history never happen to be on a stage. The greatest influences, most of the time that we see in the scriptures, it happens in homes. It happens through mothers and fathers who prayed, who sacrificed their time, their valuables, or whatever it might be. They corrected when they needed to. They encouraged when they needed to, and faithfully pointed their children towards God, trying to be the influence of being an imitator of Christ, as we see Paul speak about. And I would challenge to say that there are many here, even here today, that are in this building attending worship services or are a Christian because of the influence of their mother. Brett shaking his head. I know that's the fact with his mama. She's a good woman too. And when we think about it from a biblical aspect, I think about Moses. He had Jochebed, didn't he? You think about Samuel. We're going to talk about Samuel. He had Hannah. We think about the great preacher Timothy. He had Eunice and Lois. And that's what I want us to talk about today, is a lesson about influence in general, and something us dads too can learn from, is God's work through a mother's influence. I want us to begin our lesson in Deuteronomy chapter 6, because I think when we think about here of Deuteronomy, of course, Deuteronomy is duonamis, meaning the second reading of the law. But when he is given this second reading of the law, he is making such great emphasis on what is most important, or should be most important, in the Israelites' life. So when we look at Deuteronomy chapter 6, I want to begin in verse 4. In Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4, and I'll be reading from the New American Standard Version, it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord, He is one. You," speaking about the Israelites, "you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might. These words I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall speak of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as your frontals on your foreheads. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates." That's a challenge to each and every single one of us in this room. Whether we have children, whether we have grandchildren, great-grandchildren, nieces, nephews, cousins, sister, brother, it don't make a difference. He's showing what needs to be priority in our life. And because of this, and of course with the theme of around today, May the 10th being Mother's Day, I want us to think about this as a lesson of influence. But I want us to think about how me and you, if you're a mother, obviously I'm not, I'm a father, but how if you're a woman here that have children, or you're a mother figure or somebody, whatever it might be, well, how can you be of influence and working in the kingdom? Billy, how can you as fathers be influenced in the kingdom? Because when we think about the aspect of mothers, I think that, went too far. God's work is through mothers. When we think about what He does and through us, we have a great work before us. Because, being a mother, being a father, being of the ability of responsibility of raising is a child is a blessing. You know, when you think about, I think about Psalms chapter 127. He says, "Blessed are the children." But behold, children, behold, children are a gift of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. How blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They shall not be ashamed when they speak their enemies in the gate. Now, I guess I took that verse a little bit too literal. I got a quiver and a half full, but that's all right. Children are a blessing. Children are blessings entrusted by God. And because of that, being a mother, being a father is much more than simply caring for someone's physical needs. Parents, we have the great responsibility of feeding them spiritually. Not just giving them the needs of what they have, of when Dylan, and let me tell you, he might be little, but that little fella, if it's any indication of what he eats now, when he turns 16, I'm going to have to preach at 3 churches to be able to afford him eating. I'm telling you, that little fella eats. I've got the responsibility as his daddy to make sure he's got a full belly, right? But as he grows and as he matures, I've got the responsibility of him knowing who God is. And that in the Smithson household, that if I'm the leader that I should be, if I'm the father that I should be, if Amelia as the mother is the mother that she should be, that when they ask, or someone asks them as to who they serve, they can say that no doubt that all 5 of my children, when the 5th one gets here, that when all 5 of my children are asked that question, they say, we serve God. And there's no question as it, and I've made the determination, and I'm ashamed to say it wasn't always like that, but I've made the determination that from this point forward, that when my children are raised, that the thing that comes first isn't deer hunting. It isn't the farm. It isn't Drake's Farm Service. What comes first is Christ. What comes first is what's written in these 66 books that I carry with me. Now, you can make that determination as to whether you're going to make that a priority in your home or not. I hope you do. But because children are a gift from the Lord, as we see in Psalm chapter 127 and verse 3, we have to have the idea and attitude that we are going to be the greatest spiritual influence in their life. And as I said, I think one of the greatest spiritual influences that a child can have is their mother. If you flip over to the book of Exodus, turn over there with me. In Exodus chapter 2, in Exodus chapter 2, we are introduced to a remarkable woman by the name of Jochebed. Exodus chapter 2 and verse 1, it says, "Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and she saw that he was beautiful and hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got him in a wicker basket and covered it with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds of the banks of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. The daughter of the Pharaoh came out to bathe in the Nile with her maidens walking alongside the Nile, and she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maids and brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. And she had pity on him, and she said, 'This is one of the Hebrews' children.' Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?' Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Go ahead.' And so the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages.' So she took the child and nursed him. And as the child grew, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she became her son. And she named him Moses, and said, 'Because I drew him out of the water.'" When we look at this woman and being Jochebed, before Moses, Moses is a nobody at this point. He's just the son of a Levite. Before Moses ever stands before Amenhotep II and says, let my people go, before he comes to the Nile, before he comes to the Red Sea and parts the Red Sea, we see the faith of this woman that stands in the face of Pharaoh and says, when we see in chapter 1, what did Pharaoh said? Take the babies and throw them in the Nile. Discard them. They're nothing. She has the faith that I don't care what Pharaoh says, I'm going to serve him. And when we think about what she does, she has that baby with the faith, and because of it, she takes care of him for 3 months. I'm getting ready to have a newborn here probably around the 4th of July, right? Let me tell you, those 3 months can be tough with a capital T. Maddie started crying about 6 hours after she was born, and she ain't been quiet since. Let me tell you, that youngin' cried. She's all right now. But when I think I can have sympathy for Amram and Jochebed, of them having, you talk about faith, of knowing, hey, there ain't supposed to be any male babies here. And if Pharaoh finds it, what are they going to go? Me and the baby. And yet she has faith, and she raises this child through the providence of God. And look at what we see Moses is able to accomplish in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Why? Because of the influence that she had. Think about Hannah in 1 Samuel, in 1 Samuel chapter 1. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, it's interesting if you look at the story of Hannah, a woman that is barren, a woman that wants a child, and we see her go and pray to God. We look at 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 27. He is finally born. It says, for this boy I have prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition, which I asked for of him. So I also dedicated him to the Lord, so that as long as he lives, he is dedicated to the Lord. Well, and we see in chapter 2, her prayer. Chapter 2 and verse 1, it says, my heart exults in the Lord, my horn is exalted in the Lord, my mouth speaks the enemy boldly against my enemies. Why? Because I rejoice in your salvation. There is no one holy like the Lord. Indeed, there is no one else beside you. If you read in the book of Judges, and if you haven't been coming on Wednesday night, I want to encourage you to do so. We're almost finished with the book of Judges. And we're going to get to this here shortly, but at the end of the book of Judges is almost a scene from a fantasy book from the amount of war and treachery and just debauchery and everything that you could see happening is happening. Why? Because the Israelites have left the Lord. But in the midst of that, in the midst of the hills of what you see happening at the end of the book of Judges, you see the parents of Samuel. And in the midst of when everybody else is serving everybody but God, everybody's serving Dagon, or they're serving Baal, or whoever it might be, at the end of the day, you've got the parents of Samuel. And they want a youngin. And God gives it to him. He follows through with that. But he is found serving, she too, their parents are found serving God in the midst. Now, they could have allowed Samuel, growing up in the world that he lived in. We take Eli, who's supposed to be a judge at the time. You take Eli's sons. Crooked as crooked could be, weren't they? They could have said, well, everybody else is letting them be raised that way. We'll just let them be that way too. No, what do? He is God. There's no other gods but our God. Look at how great and valiant he is. This is who he's going to serve. And that's what Samuel does. Are we going to have the stance that we're going to have God work through us and the influence we have and our children. Because when we think about this, it is intentional. I guess I did miss a slide here. But our influence, mothers and fathers, is formed in daily life. Let's go back to our scripture reading of the book of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6. He says, you shall teach them diligently of your sons. You shall talk with them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. Well, you know what that tells me? That influence isn't just built in one giant moment of we're going to have a big party. Hey guys, come together. This is Caleb's moment of influence. I have influenced you for your life. Congratulations. Go on. That's not what we're seeing. We're seeing that it is an influential part of their everyday life. That as a father, that I'm trying to teach my children every single day. As a mother, I'm not just doing it when I sit down, all right, kids, I'm going to try to be a good influence on you when we come to church on Sunday. No. That's important. But it's also built on of what we're doing in our life. You know, I think I've told this story before. Of course, my dad's a gospel preacher. Y'all all know him. But I think one of the greatest points of influence and of teaching that I was ever taught by my dad was when we were setting taters in the garden. And I'll remember this the rest of my life. And if you've ever set taters, you know, you take a knife and cut them. What a tater's got on them that you got to plan. They got the eyes, right? We had our trench. And you're going through there and putting them taters in. Of course, I'm Davy's age or a little bit littler. And you're putting them taters in a row. And you're just, as a kid, you know, you're just wanting to help. And you're just throwing them in there. No, that ain't the way you do it. How do you do it? You put them so the eyes looked up towards heaven. So they look up towards God. Then that allows you to have a conversation of, well, that's why we serve God. And I'm 36 years old, and I still remember that lesson of influence that I had at 4. Folks, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to be an influence. It takes someone that is intentional and wanting their children to go to heaven. It takes someone that cares enough that says, hey, you might not be my youngin', but let me be the influence that I can be on you. Whether I'm setting taters in the garden, or whether I'm helping them in raking the leaves. You can talk about the change into the seasons. The seasons is life. The point is that it is built through daily consistency. It's taught through teaching moments like that. But it's also taught in the patience that you have towards them. That when God looks at you and what you've done wrong, that, you know what? God has patience on me too. And doesn't have an outburst of anger. It's Him having patience with me. It's done through correction. That when you've done wrong, that there is a price that you have to pay that when you've done wrong. Same as when you're stray in sin. It's done through encouragement. Of, hey, I realize you've had a bad day. I realize that things aren't always going to be fair. Let me encourage you as my brothers and sisters are supposed to encourage me as we see in the book of Galatians, Hebrews, where it might be. And it's done through an example. Because children will learn what matters in your life by watching what matters to you. You know why I'm a University of Tennessee football fan? Because that mattered to my daddy. If I'd have been Jesse and Matthew's third brother, I'd probably been a Kentucky fan, right? More than likely. But because that was important to my daddy, that's what became important to me. Deer hunting was important to my daddy. Deer hunting's even more important to me than to my daddy now. Bluegrass music. I've traveled all over the United States playing music with Dad on stage after stage. It's important to me. But then I think of why I stand in the pulpit today. It's because it was important to my dad. It was important to my mom. That they made going to church not just an option, it was part of who we are. It is a part of my identity. And I'm doing the best that I can. I'm not a perfect parent by no means. Y'all seen that. But that when my children look at me and preach in this pulpit, y'all don't get here early enough, some of you, to see what Davey does. But when all the times I'm getting my sermon up here, Davey, of course, he's trying to be an imitator of me, right? He'll come down to this little right here and he'll go, Church of Christ. That's what he does. Why? Because he's seeing my influence. Whether I'm a good preacher, a bad preacher, whatever, he knows that Daddy stands for preaching the Word. Now, never mind the fact he says he wants to be a paleontologist preacher, but you know what? He understands the importance of preaching the Word. Your influence might be different. Your parenting style is different than mine. But the point is that I'm trying to convey is that we have got to, whether it's your youngin, my youngin, it doesn't make a difference, is that when they look at us, they are able to know where our priorities lie. They know that it is God that we serve. You know, we see examples of this all throughout the Scriptures, but I can't help but think about, when I think about influence, I think about Timothy. You take Timothy. There is no example, if you turn over to the book of 2 Timothy, there is no example that we see anywhere that a father was present. Maybe there was, but if there was, he must have not done much because it wasn't recorded. But when we look at 2 Timothy chapter 1, and Paul is addressing Timothy, who does he bring up? He says, for I am mindful in the sincere faith within you that first dwelt in who? Your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice. And I'm sure that it is found in you as well. Sincere faith. A desire to serve. Look over just a couple of more verses in chapter 3 and verse 14. He continues this thought. He says, however, continue in the things you have learned and have been convinced of, knowing from whom you have learned them, and that from childhood you have known the sacred writings which you have been able, which are able to give you the wisdom that leads to what? Salvation. Salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus. Timothy would not have known that had it not been for his mother. Would it had not been for his grandmother? You don't think you'd have the ability to teach? You don't think you have the ability to be an example? Look around you. At your children, at your grandchildren, at your neighbors, your nieces, your nephews, whoever it might be. Because a mother's influence, a father's influence carries weight. You know, I think about all the Christmas presents that I ever received growing up. I can remember a few of the big ones, you know. 30-30 rifle when I turned 15. But all the other stuff in between, it was special at the time, but I don't remember that. But I'll tell you one thing I'll never forget is the faithfulness instruction my parents gave me. That as long as I live, that influence, what we're talking about, this influence is impressed on my brain. And we think about Timothy. Timothy learned the Scriptures from his mama and grandma long before he became a preacher. And yet as a man, when he is preaching, that's what stayed with him. Yeah, my mama's a good cook and my mama's made a lot of good recipes and all that. But you know what? I can't remember every meal I've ever ate, but I can remember what they taught me. That's what matters. That's what matters. We can do our best to work through our whole life to be able to write it when we die, that the lawyer comes up after probate court and say, "Hey, congratulations, Mr. Smithson, you have $1.5 million that your dad saved up. He left you a great thing to build on." Okay, that's cool. But at the end of the day, what does it matter? Nothing. Nothing. Half of us can get taken in taxes more than likely anyways, right? What matters is what you have taught your children about Jesus, about your home that is prepared for you by your Savior. That's why if we look over the book of Colossians, in Colossians chapter 3, in Colossians chapter 3 and in verse 16, what does it say? It says, "Let the word of Christ richly dwell within you." How is it going to dwell within you unless you have been taught it? How is it going to dwell within your children unless you teach it and influence it to them? Because if it richly dwells in us, it should richly dwell in our home and our life. Because our challenge is that God uses a mother's faith or father's, either one, to shape this next generation. Look over at the book of Psalm. Book of Psalm chapter 78. In Psalm chapter 78, in verse 4, he says, "We will not conceal them from our children, but to tell the generation to come the praises of the Lord and His strength and His wondrous works that He has done." You know, faith in God and service to God has a ripple effect. You know, God never intended His faith or service to Him in faith to stop with one generation. Children, obviously, when they leave the home, can still make their own choices. But statistically, a child that has had instruction, a child that has had an environment that will help create growth in faith, and one that reveres God, statistically, they have the back end and stay true. It's not always the case, but even if they do leave, they know who they are to serve. And that's why when Paul told Timothy that in 1 or 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5, that he said that he had the genuine faith that was in him, that had first dwelt in Lois and Eunice. You know, Timothy, when we think about Timothy, Timothy had seen that influence, that genuine faith. He had seen that lived out in front of him every single day. Because children, and I learn this more every single day, children are some of the greatest judges of character that we can meet. Children, even though you might be able to fool them by thinking you pulled your finger off or whatever, when they can tell when something is real. They can tell that whether your service to God is real or if it's just something that you're doing to put on a show. Children can see that. They know when your worship is sincere. That whether you're sitting on the pew just going, "Boy, the fish are biting. Boy, I wish he'd shut up so we can get out of here." I can't say nothing. My boat's hooked up to my truck right now. It is. Kids are dying to go jugging this afternoon. But do they look at you and say, "You know what? Yes, he might want to go fishing. Yes, he might need a bush hog. Yes, he might want to do whatever. But he's here because it matters to him. It has value." And children can look at you and realize that whether your Christianity matters every single day of the week, that daddy cusses like a sailor throughout the week, but on Sunday, boy, he's got that suit on and he's ready to go. They can tell what's real and what ain't real. They can see through the charade. That's why we have to have that everlasting influence on them. And also, even though children can be leaving their first love of being Christ and the church, a mother's influence should continue when she doesn't see results too. One of the hardest parts of parenting is not always seeing immediate results. As we said, sometimes children will drift. Sometimes they will rebel. And sometimes, especially mothers, will carry heartbreak and heartache more than anybody else sees. But regardless of that, faithfulness to God still matters. If we look over the book of Galatians, in Galatians chapter 6, Paul addresses this. He says, "Let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary." If we not grow weary. Influence is often worked slowly. Seeds don't produce fruit overnight, do they? I planted my beans on March the 28th. They're about that big. Now, it would have been foolish of me to, as soon as I backed the planter in the shed and I said, "All right, Drago, remind me how to set these concaves. I'm ready to go." Drago, what did we just said? Well, you just planted yesterday. You think your beans are ready to cut today? It doesn't work like that, does it? It takes time for seeds to produce fruit. And so is the same with the influence of our children. And when you might get discouraged of saying, "I might not be doing enough," or "I should have done this," or "I should have done that," that's why we have to not lose heart, as we see here in the book of Galatians, and keep praying. Keep teaching. Keep loving and keep trying to set the example that we should. Because sometimes seeds planted in childhood will bear fruit years later. People that were raised in church, came to church growing up, and their parents were faithful Christians, and for whatever reason, they were drawn away, like we see at the prodigal son. And years later come back to the truth because that influence was remembered. Because I guarantee you that there are Christians today that remember what their parents did for them, that there are faithful families today because a mother stayed faithful to Christ when it was difficult. Me and Brett's talked about that before. If you don't know Brett's mama, you need to get to know her. She's one of the best women I know. That serving God even when you don't have the support that you should have. Of serving God when the kids maybe or may not want to go. But putting God first regardless. It says, "As for me and my house, we're going to serve God." Men, we should be able to give our wives a support that they ain't got a second guess as to whether we got their back when it comes to coming to services and serving. They should be able to look at us as the leader. Don't worry, there's a sermon coming for that too. Of the responsibilities that we have. And let me tell you, they're big. But to the women that may or may not have a husband that is leading that, praise be to you that you've got the determination to be here and to raise your children and grandchildren, whatever it might be. That they can look at you and see the influence that you have and that you put Christ first. That's not easy, especially when you're not getting the support that you need. But when we look time and time again, we have to realize who is in control. If you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 3, in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 6, Paul's talking about increase. He says, "I planted, Apollos watered, but it was God was causing the growth." God is the one that we have to put our faith in regardless of the fact, even when the going gets tough. Because when it's all said and done, I want to say that God honors faithful motherhood, and honors faithful fatherhood. Because, the world might overlook a parent that has been faithful in what they have trying to bring their children to Christ. The world is known for giving accolades to people that, have the highest Roth IRA, the highest 401k or whatever. They got the most nicest car, the biggest house or whatever. But book of Hebrews paints a different story. You look over at the book of Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 10. In Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 10, he says, "For God is not unjust as to forget your work and the love which you have shown towards His name, have been ministered and in still ministering to the saints. And we desire that each one of you show the same diligence as to the full assurance of the hope until the end." God sees your effort. He sees the prayers that you make. He sees the acts of love, the acts of influence. And even when being faithful to Him might seem unnoticed, there is someone that looks and sees, and that's God, because God sees what others overlook. It makes me think about, of course, we're all familiar with Proverbs chapter 31 of, the virtuous woman. But when you think about chapter 31 and verse 28, he says, "Her children rise up and bless her. Also her husband, and he praises her." One of the greatest blessings that a person can have is a mother, grandmother, or mother figure, whatever it might be, that has done what they can do to point them to Christ. Now, no mama's perfect. Mine ain't perfect. She's close. She ain't perfect. Every parent has regrets in the parenthood process. There's things, my oldest ain't quite 10 yet, but there's things that I regret that I wish I should have done differently. But God honors those who are faithful in trying to teach their children to pray, that try to teach their children to teach or be influenced for good. Because as we see time and time again, if you look over the book of Colossians, in Colossians chapter 3, in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 23, he says, "Whatever you do, do your work heartily, as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of inheritance." Why? It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. That's who we serve. Because the greatest influence we could have, the greatest work that we could have, it's not on a stage. It's not in front of crowds, but it's every day in our homes. And it's through mothers and fathers who pray and teach and encourage and sacrifice and stay faithful to God and putting Him first day after day. So to everyone that's here, I want us to encourage us from one final verse in Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 6. Where the proverb writer says, "Train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he shall not depart from it." That's our challenge. That's our rally cry. But the fact is, we all, at some point in our life, will depart from the Lord and turning our back on Him through sin. The book of Romans says everyone has fallen short of the sin and fallen short of the glory of God. And because of that, we need salvation. Me, you, every person that's ever been born by a mama needs salvation. What was it Barney Fife said? All of God's children need salvation. Maybe you're here this morning and you have turned your back on the teachings of what you had when you were younger. If you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and you're willing to repent, quit living for yourself, and start living for Him, and are willing to confess that He is the Christ, the Son of God, and are willing to be baptized with the watery grave of baptism and be risen up, let me tell you, there's no greater gift to give to your mama on Mother's Day than to know that you have given yourself to God. That is a true gift. Maybe you're here and you've not been living like you ought to. You have forgotten the things that you've done. Come back to God before it's too late. Let's all leave here this morning ready for the Lord to come back. If there's any need for salvation this morning, come forward, be standing and sing the song that Owen selected. Thanks for listening. And if you have any questions about the things we're studying, send us a message at www.caneyvillechurchofchrist.com. You can also find a complete library of all of our sermons on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We look forward to studying the Word of God with you.